It was one of those slow, sticky afternoons in late August, the kind where the air feels thick and time seems to drag. Two patrol officers cruised through a quiet neighborhood on the edge of town, windows down, radios crackling with routine chatter. They'd just wrapped up a call about a barking dog and were killing time before their shift ended. That's when they saw her. She was sitting alone on a weathered park bench beneath a big oak tree, dressed in a crisp navy suit, reading what looked like legal papers. Her posture was calm, focused. She wasn't talking to anyone, wasn't causing a scene, just waiting, maybe for someone, maybe just taking a quiet moment in the shade. But to the officers, something about her presence felt off. Not because she was doing anything wrong, but because she didn't fit the usual picture of who belonged in that spot at that hour. They pulled over. One officer stayed by the car while the other walked up, hand resting near his belt. "Ma'am, you mind telling us what you're doing here?" he asked, voice edged with suspicion. She looked up slowly, not startled, just measured. "I'm meeting a colleague from the courthouse," she said evenly. "We're reviewing a brief before a hearing tomorrow." The officer frowned. "You got ID?" She reached into her bag but moved slowly, careful not to make any sudden gestures. "Of course," she said, pulling out a leather wallet. Before she could open it, the second officer joined them, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. "Why are you sitting out here like this? You live around here?" he asked, voice sharp. "No," she replied, "but I don't need to live here to sit on a public bench." That answer seemed to rattle them. To them, her calm tone sounded like defiance. Her stillness read as arrogance. They didn't see a respected legal mind taking a breath between duties. They saw a black woman who didn't know her place. And in that moment, their training gave way to assumption. "Hands behind your back," one of them said suddenly. She blinked. "Excuse me? You're under arrest for obstruction." "For what?" she asked, voice steady but firm. "I haven't done anything." "Don't make this harder," the other officer warned, stepping closer. A small crowd had started to gather. Neighbors walking dogs, a teenager on a bike slowing down, someone filming from a porch, but the officers weren't listening. They grabbed her arms, twisted them behind her back, and snapped on plastic zip ties. She didn't resist. She knew better. Instead, she kept her eyes forward, jaw set, breathing slowly through the shock and shame of it all. Then came the worst part. With no squad car nearby and no clear plan, one officer muttered, "We can't just leave her standing here." After a quick, careless glance around, he walked over to the thick trunk of the oak tree, pulled out another zip tie and looped it around a low branch. Without a word of explanation or apology, they fastened her to the tree like she was a piece of equipment, not a person. People gasped. Someone shouted, "Are you serious right now?" But the officers just stood back, arms crossed, smirking slightly as if they'd handled a problem, not created one. "Guess you'll learn to answer questions next time," one of them said with a dry chuckle. She didn't respond. She just stood there, bound to the tree, suit wrinkled, dignity bruised but not broken. Her mind raced, not with fear but with disbelief. How many times had she read cases like this? How many rulings had she written about excessive force, about the presumption of innocence, about the dangerous gap between perception and reality when it came to race and authority? And now she was living it. The minutes dragged. Sweat gathered at her temples. Her shoulders ached from the awkward angle. But what hurt more was the casual cruelty, the way they laughed under their breath, the way they treated her like a nuisance rather than a citizen. She thought about the brief in her bag, the arguments she'd spent all week crafting about judicial fairness. The irony was almost too heavy to carry. Then a woman from the crowd stepped forward. "This is wrong," she said firmly. "She hasn't done anything." "Stay back," an officer warned, hand on his baton. But the woman didn't back down. "I know who she is," she said, voice rising. "And you have no idea what you've just done." The officers exchanged a glance, confused, maybe a little uneasy, but brushed it off. "Lady, mind your business," one snapped. What they didn't know was that the woman filming from the porch worked at the state courthouse. She recognized the suit, the posture, the quiet intensity, and she knew exactly who was tied to that tree. Within 20 minutes, the video was online. Grainy, shaky, but unmistakable. A respected figure in the legal world, calm, professional, clearly not a threat, bound to a tree like a criminal, while officers stood by joking. By the time backup arrived and finally cut her loose, the story was already spreading. News alerts pinged on phones across the city. Social media lit up with outrage. People weren't just angry about the force used. They were stunned by the sheer disrespect, the dehumanizing act of tying someone to a tree in broad daylight. She walked away without saying a word to the officers. No threats, no tears, just a quiet dignity that spoke louder than any shout. She got into her car, drove to her office, and changed out of her rumpled suit. Then she sat at her desk staring out the window, thinking not about revenge but about what this moment revealed, because this wasn't just about her. It was about every person who'd ever been judged not by their actions but by how they looked. It was about the gap between the law as it's written and the law as it's enforced. And it was about power, how it can blind people to the humanity standing right in front of them. She didn't know it yet, but that oak tree would become more than a site of humiliation. It would become a turning point, not just for her, but for an entire system that had looked away for too long. But all of that was still ahead. For now, she just needed to breathe, to remember that even when the world treats you like you don't belong, your worth doesn't shrink. It only shines brighter. The zip ties left angry red marks around her wrists, but the deeper wounds were the ones no one could see. She sat in her office long after dark, blinds drawn, streetlights casting long shadows across the floor. Outside, the city buzzed with normal life. Cars honking, people laughing, music drifting from open windows. But inside, everything felt still heavy. She replayed the scene over and over, the smirks, the casual cruelty, the way they'd treated her like she was nothing. Like she didn't matter. She hadn't cried. Not yet. But her hands trembled slightly as she poured a glass of water. It wasn't fear. It was the shock of being reduced to a stereotype in broad daylight, in front of strangers by people sworn to protect. Meanwhile, just a few miles away, the video was exploding online. At first, it was just a shaky clip shared in a local neighborhood group. Cops tied a woman to a tree. Within an hour, it jumped to citywide forums. By midnight, national news outlets were picking it up. The footage was raw, no filters, no edits, just a clear shot of a well-dressed woman standing silently, arms bound behind her back, zip-tied to the thick trunk of an old oak. Two officers stood nearby, relaxed, almost bored, as if this were routine. One even laughed at something the other said. People couldn't believe it. Comments poured in. Is this 2024 or 1924? She looks like a lawyer or judge. Why would they do this? This is straight up dehumanizing. A law student who recognized her from a recent court appearance posted, "That's the new Chief Justice. I saw her speak last month." That comment went viral. By morning, the story had a name: the Oak Tree Incident. News vans lined the quiet street where it happened. Reporters knocked on neighbors' doors asking for more footage, more details. The police department issued a vague statement. An investigation is underway. But the public wasn't satisfied. They wanted answers. They wanted accountability. Back at her apartment, she watched the coverage on a muted TV while sipping tea. She felt strange, exposed, yet strangely invisible. Everyone was talking about her, but no one was really seeing her. They saw a symbol, a victim, a headline, but she was still just a person who'd gone out for a quiet moment and come home humiliated. Her phone buzzed nonstop. Colleagues, friends, even people she hadn't spoken to in years, all checking in, offering support, asking if she was okay. She appreciated it, but what she really needed was space to think, not as a public figure, not as a judge, but as a human being trying to make sense of something senseless. That afternoon, she walked to a nearby park, not the one with the oak tree, but a smaller, quieter one tucked between apartment buildings. She sat on a bench watching kids chase pigeons, an old man feeding squirrels, a couple sharing ice cream. Normal life. Simple kindness. It reminded her why she'd gone into law in the first place. Not for power or prestige, but because she believed in fairness. In dignity. In the idea that everyone deserves to be treated like they matter. But belief doesn't always match reality. As she sat there, a young woman approached hesitantly. "Excuse me? Are you—" She didn't finish the sentence, but her eyes said it all. Recognition, concern, maybe even hope. The woman nodded gently. "Yes," the young woman's voice dropped. "My brother. He was stopped last year for no reason. They threw him on the ground, called him names. He's never been the same." She paused, then added, "Seeing what happened to you, it made me feel less alone. That hit hard." Because this wasn't just about her. It was about every person who'd been made to feel small by someone in a uniform. Every time someone's calm was mistaken for defiance, their presence treated as a threat. She realized then that her silence, her refusal to scream or fight back, had spoken louder than she'd intended. People saw strength in it. They saw grace under fire. Still, the weight of it pressed down. She knew the officers probably didn't wake up that morning thinking, "Let's humiliate a high-ranking judge today." They likely saw a black woman alone in a nice neighborhood and jumped to conclusions. That's the danger, not malice, but assumption. Not hatred, but habit, and habits like that run deep. By evening, the police chief held a press conference. He looked tired, stressed. "We take this incident very seriously," he said, avoiding eye contact with the cameras. "Body cam footage is being reviewed. The officers involved have been placed on administrative leave." He didn't apologize. Not really. Just regret any distress caused. She watched it from her living room and sighed. Words without action were just noise. But something else was happening too, something quieter but powerful. Community groups organized a peaceful gathering near the oak tree the next day. Not a protest exactly, more like a vigil. People brought flowers, signs that read "Dignity for All" and "See Us," not stereotypes. A local choir sang "Lift Every Voice." Someone placed a single white rose at the base of the tree. She didn't go, not because she didn't appreciate it, but because she needed to decide what came next. Would she speak out, sue? Demand the officers be fired? Part of her wanted to. But another part, the part shaped by years in the courtroom, knew that real change wasn't just about punishing two individuals. It was about fixing a system that allowed this to happen in the first place. Late that night, she opened her laptop and began drafting a letter. Not to the police, not to the media, but to the state's judicial council. She wrote about implicit bias, about the gap between policy and practice, about how even the most well-intentioned officers can cause harm when they don't question their own assumptions. She proposed mandatory training, not as punishment but as prevention, as protection, for officers and for the public. She didn't mention her name once in the draft. This wasn't about her story. It was about making sure no one else had to live it. Outside, the city slept, but inside her mind something had shifted. The shame she'd felt under that tree was slowly turning into resolve. She hadn't asked for this moment, but now that it was here, she wouldn't waste it. Because dignity isn't just something you're given. It's something you defend. For yourself, and for everyone who comes after you. And as she closed her laptop, she finally let herself cry. Not from pain, but from purpose. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. But for the first time since that afternoon, she felt like herself again. Not just a judge. Not just a symbol. But a person who refused to let injustice have the last word. The next morning, everything changed. It started with a local news anchor stumbling over her words during the 6 a.m. broadcast. "We have a major update in the oak tree incident," she said, glancing down at her notes like she couldn't believe them herself. "The woman who was restrained by officers has been identified as the newly appointed Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court." Silence. Then chaos. Within minutes, phones rang off the hook at City Hall, the police department, even the governor's office. Reporters who'd been chasing the story as a case of possible police misconduct suddenly realized they were covering something far bigger, a direct collision between law, enforcement, and the highest judicial authority in the state. And not just any authority, the first black woman ever to hold that position. Social media exploded all over again, but this time with a different tone. Before, people were angry about what looked like racial profiling. Now they were stunned by the sheer irony and the danger of it all. They tied the Chief Justice to a tree. One post read, "Imagine doing that to the person who could literally rule on your job, your pension, your future." Another said, "If they'd treat her like that, what chance do the rest of us have?" At the courthouse, staff arrived to find news trucks circling like hawks. Cameras pointed at every entrance. Inside, clerks and lawyers whispered in hallways, some furious, others embarrassed, all trying to process what had happened. One veteran bailiff shook his head and muttered, "After everything she's done for this system, this is how they treat her." Meanwhile, she sat in her chambers, calm but alert. She hadn't planned to go public so soon. Her appointment had only been confirmed 3 weeks earlier, and she'd wanted time to settle in quietly, to listen, to understand the court's rhythm before stepping fully into the spotlight. But now the spotlight had found her, whether she was ready or not. Her phone buzzed constantly. The governor called personally, voice tight with concern. "This is unacceptable," he said. "We're launching a full investigation. I want you to know, you have my full support." She thanked him politely but didn't say much. Support was easy to offer after the fact. What mattered was what came next. By mid-morning, the police chief held an emergency press conference. This time he looked pale, his usual confidence gone. "We were unaware of the individual's identity at the time of the incident," he admitted, avoiding the word judge or justice, as if saying it might make things worse. "We deeply regret the manner in which this situation was handled." For the first time, he used the word apologize, though it felt more like damage control than true remorse. But the public wasn't buying it. Memes spread online showing cartoon officers tying gavels and scales of justice to trees. Legal scholars wrote op-eds about how this incident exposed a dangerous disconnect between those who enforce the law and those who interpret it. Even retired judges, some of them white, some conservative, spoke out. "If this can happen to her," one said on a morning talk show, "it can happen to anyone." Back in her office, she reviewed the body cam footage that had just been released. Watching herself on screen was surreal. There she was, calm, composed, answering questions clearly, while the officers grew more aggressive by the second. She noticed small things. How one officer kept glancing at his partner like he was waiting for permission to escalate. How neither asked her name. How they never once checked her ID before deciding she was a threat. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a pattern. What hurt most wasn't the physical restraint. It was the assumption that she didn't belong. That a black woman in a suit sitting quietly in a public space must be up to no good. That her presence alone was suspicious. And that belief, unspoken but powerful, had led directly to her being tied to a tree like a piece of stray property. Later that day, a group of law students gathered outside the courthouse with handmade signs. "We stand with justice." They weren't protesting. They were honoring. One held a sign that read, "You taught us the law. Now you're living its lesson." She watched from her window, touched but also burdened. She didn't want to be a symbol. She just wanted to do her job. But symbols have power, and in that moment she realized she couldn't hide from what this meant. Not for her, but for everyone who looked like her, who'd been treated the same way but never had a title to protect them. That evening, she made a quiet decision. She wouldn't give interviews. She wouldn't call for the officers to be jailed. But she would use her position, not for revenge, but for repair. She called a meeting with the state's top legal advisors and laid out a plan. A statewide review of police protocols during nonviolent encounters, mandatory bias training co-designed with community leaders, and a new policy requiring officers to verify identity and intent before using restraints in low-risk situations. "This isn't about me," she told them firmly. "It's about making sure no grandmother, no student, no professional, no human being is treated like a suspect just because they exist in the wrong place at the wrong time." News of her response began to spread, not through press releases but through word of mouth. People admired her restraint. Her focus on solutions, not shame. Even critics who'd questioned her appointment now saw her strength, not in anger but in clarity. By the end of the day, the story had shifted again. It was no longer just cops tie woman to tree. It was Chief Justice turns humiliation into hope. And though she never asked for that headline, she knew it came with responsibility. Because now, the whole state was watching, not just to see how she'd respond, but to see what kind of justice she would build from this broken moment. And she was ready. Not with fury, but with faith in the law, in people, and in the quiet, stubborn belief that even the deepest wounds can become the seeds of change. Inside the police department, the mood turned heavy, like the air before a storm. What had started as a routine call had spiraled into a full-blown crisis, and now everyone was scrambling to figure out who to blame, who to protect, and how to survive the fallout. The two officers involved were sent home on paid leave, as required by policy, but that didn't stop the whispers. In the locker room, some officers defended them. "They couldn't have known who she was," one said, shrugging. "You can't expect us to guess someone's job just by looking at them." Others stayed quiet, uncomfortable with how quickly things had escalated. A few younger officers, especially those who were people of color, exchanged knowing glances. They'd been there before, not tied to a tree. Maybe, but stopped, questioned, made to feel like outsiders in their own city. They knew this wasn't really about identity. It was about assumption. The police union issued a statement that tried to walk a careful line. It expressed concern for the woman's experience but also warned against rushing to judgment against the officers. Law enforcement is under constant pressure, it read. Split-second decisions shouldn't be judged with perfect hindsight. The words sounded reasonable on paper, but to many in the community, they felt like an excuse. Like the system was circling its wagons instead of asking hard questions. Meanwhile, the chief of police was under fire from every direction. The mayor wanted answers. The governor wanted reforms. The public wanted accountability. And deep down, even he knew something had gone terribly wrong. He'd watched the body cam footage himself more than once, and each time, he felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Not because the officers broke a clear rule, but because they'd broken something harder to define. Trust. The kind of trust that takes years to build and seconds to shatter. He called a closed-door meeting with his command staff. We can't pretend this didn't happen, he said, voice low. And we can't act like it's just about two bad apples. People are asking if this is how we treat everyone who doesn't look like us. No one argued. They'd all seen the data, the complaints, the patterns, but admitting it out loud felt dangerous, like opening a door they couldn't close. Outside the station, the tension spilled into the streets. Community leaders held a town hall in a local church basement. Over 100 people showed up. Elders, teens, small business owners, teachers. Some shared stories of being followed in stores, pulled over for no reason, spoken to like they were criminals just for walking home. One woman, voice shaking, said, "If they did that to her, someone with power with a title, what do you think they do to the rest of us when no one's watching?" The room fell silent. That was the real fear, not just what happened that day, but what it revealed about everyday life for so many. Back at the department, Internal Affairs launched a formal investigation. They reviewed every second of footage, interviewed witnesses, checked radio logs. It didn't take long to see the truth. There had been no threat, no resistance, no legal reason to detain her, let alone bind her to a tree. The officers had acted on instinct, not evidence. And that instinct, shaped by years of unconscious bias, had led them to treat a respected public servant like a suspect. Still, not everyone saw it that way. In online forums and late-night radio shows, a different narrative took hold. Some claimed the whole thing was blown out of proportion. She should have just cooperated, one comment read. Why make a scene? Others suggested she'd played the race card or used her position to get special treatment. But those voices grew quieter as more people saw the video. You couldn't unsee the image of a dignified woman standing silently, while zip ties were wrapped around her wrists and then around a tree branch like she was livestock. The officers themselves stayed out of sight. One gave a brief interview to a local reporter off the record saying, "We were just doing our jobs. We didn't know." But not knowing wasn't enough anymore. In a city, and a country, still healing from years of similar incidents, not knowing felt like another form of ignoring. What made this case different, though, was who it happened to. Most victims of over-policing don't have a platform, a title, or the legal knowledge to fight back. But she did. And while she chose not to attack personally, her very existence in that role forced the system to look in the mirror. At the courthouse, staff began noticing small changes. Officers assigned to security detail started double-checking their tone, their posture, their assumptions. One veteran sergeant even asked for a copy of the proposed bias training materials, saying, "Maybe we all need a refresher." It wasn't a full turnaround, but it was a start. The real test, though, would come in how the department responded, not just to this incident, but to the deeper issues it exposed. Would they treat it as an isolated mistake, or as a symptom of something bigger? For now, the two officers waited at home, unsure if they'd ever wear the badge again. Their families fielded angry calls. Their neighbors avoided eye contact. They'd gone from feeling like protectors to feeling like pariahs, and they still didn't fully understand why. But the truth was simple. They hadn't just restrained a woman. They'd shaken the public's faith in the whole idea of fair treatment under the law, and rebuilding that trust would take more than apologies. It would take change, real, lasting, uncomfortable change. And as the days passed, one thing became clear. This wasn't just about 2 officers anymore. It was about an entire system being asked to choose between comfort and courage, between old habits and new hope. The answer wouldn't come from a press release or a policy memo. It would come from the choices people made when no cameras were rolling, when no one was watching. That's where real justice begins. She didn't hold a press conference. She didn't go on TV. She didn't post a statement on social media. In a world that often rewards loud reactions, she chose something quieter, but far more powerful: silence with purpose. While cameras camped outside her building and reporters chased rumors about her next move, she went back to work. Not with fanfare, not with anger, but with the same steady focus she'd always had. She reviewed case files, met with clerks, listened to arguments in court. To anyone watching closely, it was clear she wasn't hiding. She was preparing. Her first public appearance after the incident came 2 weeks later, at a statewide judicial conference held in a modest downtown hotel. The room was packed. Judges, lawyers, law students, even a few community organizers filled the chairs, all wondering what she would say. Would she call for the officers to be fired? Demand a federal investigation? Speak about the pain of what happened? Instead, she stood at the podium, calm and composed, and spoke about something deeper. We often talk about justice as if it's a building, she began, her voice clear but gentle. Strong walls, solid foundation, clear rules. But justice isn't stone or steel. It's human. It lives in the choices we make when no one's watching, in the assumptions we challenge or ignore. She didn't mention the oak tree. She didn't name the officers. But everyone in the room knew exactly what she meant. When someone stands before you, whether in a courtroom, on a street corner, or under a tree, they bring more than their actions. They bring their history, their dignity, their right to be seen as they are, not as we imagine them to be. She paused. And if those who enforce the law cannot see that humanity, then the whole system trembles. The room was silent, not out of fear but respect, because she wasn't speaking as a victim. She was speaking as a leader, someone who understood that real change doesn't come from shouting but from shifting hearts. After her talk, people lined up to speak with her. A young public defender, eyes bright, said, "Thank you for reminding us why we do this work." An older judge, known for his tough rulings, simply shook her hand and said, "You've given us all something to think about." Back home, she kept her routine simple. Mornings with coffee and case notes. Evenings with walks through quiet neighborhoods, never the one with the oak tree, but others where kids played and neighbors waved. She needed to remember that the world wasn't just courtrooms and headlines. It was also front porches, grocery lines, school pickups, real life. And real people deserved real protection, not just in theory but in practice. What surprised many was how she handled the flood of support. Letters poured in from across the state, some from strangers, some from people who'd faced similar treatment. She read everyone, and she wrote back to many, not with grand promises but with simple words. "I hear you. You matter. Keep speaking up." Civil rights groups asked her to lead rallies or endorse legislation. She politely declined most invitations, not because she didn't care, but because she believed her role demanded something different. She wasn't an activist. She was a judge, and her power lay not in protest but in principle, in using her position to build systems that prevented injustice before it happened. Behind the scenes, she worked tirelessly. She met with police trainers, community leaders, even former officers who'd spoken out about bias in their own ranks. She listened more than she talked. She asked questions like, what would have changed that day? And how do we help officers pause before they act? She wasn't looking for blame. She was looking for bridges. One afternoon, she visited a local high school, not as the Chief Justice, but as a guest speaker for a civics class. The students were nervous at first, but she put them at ease with stories from her own youth. Times she'd been doubted, overlooked, told she didn't belong. "But I kept showing up," she said, "not to prove them wrong, but to prove to myself that I mattered." A student raised her hand. "What do you do when the people who are supposed to protect you hurt you instead?" She didn't flinch. "You speak. You organize. You vote. You run for office. You become the change you need to see." Then she added softly, "And sometimes you wait for the right moment to turn pain into purpose." That moment, for her, wasn't on a protest stage. It was in policy meetings, in draft legislation, in quiet conversations where real decisions were made. She knew that outrage fades but laws last. And if she could help shape laws that made moments like the oak tree incident impossible, then her humiliation would mean something. The media eventually moved on to other stories. The news vans disappeared. The hashtags slowed. But she didn't stop. Because for her, this was never about staying in the spotlight. It was about making sure the light stayed on for everyone. And slowly people began to notice the difference. Not in dramatic headlines, but in small shifts. Police departments in 3 counties signed up for the new bias awareness training she helped design. A state senator introduced a bill requiring de-escalation as the first response in nonviolent encounters. Even the police academy updated its curriculum to include real-life scenarios about implicit bias. Scenarios inspired by what happened under that oak tree. She never took credit. But those who knew her understood. This was her way of healing. Not by looking back in anger, but by building a future where no one else would have to stand bound to a tree while the world watched. And did nothing. And in her quiet strength, people found something rare, hope that wasn't loud but lasting. Because real leadership isn't always about the loudest voice. Sometimes it's about the one that speaks truth so clearly, the whole world has no choice but to listen. The investigation took weeks, but the truth came out faster than anyone expected. Internal Affairs reviewed every piece of evidence, the body cam footage, witness statements, radio logs, and the conclusion was clear. There had been no legal reason to detain her, let alone bind her to a tree. She hadn't resisted. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't even moved suddenly. She'd simply existed in a public space, and that alone had been enough to trigger a response rooted more in assumption than in law. The department's disciplinary board met behind closed doors. The 2 officers sat at a long table, stiff in their civilian clothes, eyes downcast. They'd been told this wasn't a criminal hearing. It was about whether they still belonged in uniform. One of them kept repeating, "We didn't know who she was." But the board chair, a retired judge brought in for impartiality, leaned forward and said quietly, "That's exactly the problem. You treated her like she didn't matter, because you didn't take the time to see who she really was." In the end, the decision was unanimous. Both officers were terminated. Not suspended. Not reassigned. Fired. The official statement cited failure to follow use of force protocols, violation of dignity, standards, and conduct unbecoming of an officer. It was one of the swiftest and clearest disciplinary actions the department had taken in years. But the story didn't end there. One of the officers, the one who'd made the joke while she was tied to the tree, filed a lawsuit, not against her but against the city. He claimed he'd been fired unfairly, that the decision was influenced by public pressure and racial politics, and that as a white officer, he was being made a scapegoat. The lawsuit made headlines again, but this time the reaction was different. Even some of his former colleagues shook their heads. "You can't say you were just doing your job," one veteran officer told a reporter off the record, "when your job is supposed to be protecting people, not humiliating them." Legal experts pointed out the irony. An officer who'd ignored basic rights was now claiming his own rights were violated. The case dragged on for months, but it never gained much traction. Judges dismissed key parts of the suit, noting that public employees don't have the right to keep their jobs when they break clear department policies. Still, the filing left a sour taste, like an attempt to rewrite history to turn accountability into victimhood. The other officer stayed silent. He moved out of town, changed his phone number, and disappeared from public view. Friends said he was ashamed, not angry, that he'd replayed the footage over and over, not to find excuses, but to understand where he'd gone wrong. He never spoke publicly, but months later a letter arrived at the courthouse, unsigned, typed on plain paper. It read, "I failed that day. Not because I didn't know who she was, but because I didn't treat her like a person. I'm working to be better." No one confirmed it was from him, but those who read it felt its weight. Meanwhile, the community watched closely. Many had hoped for criminal charges, assault, false imprisonment, something that carried real legal consequences. But prosecutors reviewed the case and decided not to press charges. While the actions were inappropriate and violated policy, the district attorney explained, proving criminal intent beyond a reasonable doubt is a much higher bar. It was a legal truth. but it felt like a letdown to many who'd hoped for more. Still, something had shifted. Even without jail time, the firing sent a message. This kind of behavior wouldn't be tolerated, not even when the victim happened to be powerful. And that mattered. Because for years people had been told, if you just follow the rules, you'll be fine. But this showed that sometimes following the rules isn't enough. You have to be seen as worthy of them. And now, at least, there was a consequence for failing to see someone's humanity. In neighborhoods that had long distrusted the police, the outcome sparked cautious hope. It's not perfect, said one community organizer at a local meeting, but it's a start. For once someone in power was believed. Others were more skeptical. What about the people who don't have a title? One woman asked. Who speaks for them when no cameras are rolling? It was a fair question, and one that kept the pressure on for deeper reform. Back at the courthouse, she heard all of it. The disappointment, the hope, the doubt. She didn't comment on the lawsuit or the lack of criminal charges. But in private conversations, she made it clear, justice isn't only about punishment. Sometimes it's about prevention, and the real victory wouldn't be measured in firings or lawsuits, but in whether the next officer facing a similar situation would pause and choose differently. A few months later, a new recruit at the police academy was shown the body cam footage as part of training, not to shame but to teach. This is what happens, the instructor said, when we let bias override procedure. The recruits watched in silence. Some looked away. Others took notes. One later wrote in a reflection, I never thought about how a simple stop could go so wrong. Now I will. That was the ripple effect no one had predicted. The incident hadn't just exposed a failure, it had become a lesson, a warning, a turning point. And though the two officers' paths had diverged, one fighting the system, the other quietly trying to change, both were living proof that actions have consequences, even when they're not the ones you expect. For her, there was no triumph in their downfall, only relief that the system had for once worked the way it was supposed to. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to show that dignity matters, even when it's wrapped in a navy suit and tied to a tree. What happened under that oak tree could have ended as just another painful story, another video, another apology, another promise quickly forgotten. But it didn't, because instead of letting anger consume her, she chose to build something better from the broken pieces. And that's when real change began. A few weeks after the incident, she quietly called a meeting, not with reporters or politicians, but with people who understood both the law and the streets. There was a retired police sergeant who'd spent his last decade teaching de-escalation, a community organizer who'd lost a brother to police violence, a young public defender who'd seen too many clients treated like suspects just for existing, and even a former officer who'd left the force after speaking out about bias. They met in a small conference room at the courthouse. No cameras, no press, just coffee and honesty. I don't want this to be about me, she said, leaning forward. I want it to be about making sure no one else has to go through what I did, especially people who don't have a title to protect them. That meeting became the seed of something bigger. They formed a task force, unofficial at first, but driven by real purpose. They didn't just talk about problems. They dug into solutions. What if every officer had to confirm someone's identity and intent before using restraints in nonviolent situations? What if de-escalation wasn't just a chapter in a manual, but a skill practiced in real-time simulations? What if community members helped design the training so it reflected real life, not just theory? She used her position not to command, but to connect. She reached out to lawmakers not with demands, but with data and stories. She shared anonymous accounts from people who'd been stopped for walking while black or driving while brown. She showed how small moments of disrespect, like being followed in a store or questioned for sitting on a bench, add up to deep distrust in the whole system. To everyone's surprise, support started coming from unexpected places. A conservative state senator, known for backing law enforcement, read the task force's early recommendations and said, "This isn't about being soft on crime. It's about being smart on safety." Even some police unions, after initial resistance, agreed to pilot the new training in 3 counties. "If it helps our officers avoid mistakes," one union rep admitted, "then it helps all of us." The turning point came when she proposed what would later be called the Dignity Protocol. It wasn't flashy. It didn't call for defunding or dismantling. Instead, it focused on 3 simple rules. Pause before you act. Take a breath. Ask yourself, is this person a threat or just different? 2. Verify before you escalate. Get a name. Understand the situation. Don't assume. Respect always. Even if someone is frustrated or confused, treat them like a human being. It sounded basic, almost too simple. But that was the point. Real change often starts with returning to basics. She presented the protocol at a joint hearing with lawmakers and law enforcement leaders. No dramatic speeches, just clear, calm reasoning. We don't need to choose between safety and respect, she said. They go hand in hand. When people trust those who protect them, communities are safer for everyone. The room was quiet when she finished. Then one by one, hands went up, not to argue, but to ask how they could help. Within months, the state legislature passed a bill adopting the Dignity Protocol statewide. It required all police departments to update their training, include community input, and report annually on use of force incidents in nonviolent encounters. It wasn't perfect and it wouldn't fix everything overnight, but it was a start, and a rare moment of bipartisan agreement on an issue that usually divided people. Schools began inviting officers to speak alongside community leaders, not as authority figures but as neighbors learning together. High school students even helped design role-playing scenarios for new recruits. Situations like a woman sitting alone in a park or a teen walking home late. The goal wasn't to shame officers, but to build empathy. And slowly, stories started changing. A mother in a small town called a local news station to say that when her son was stopped for a broken taillight, the officer asked how his day was going, explained the issue calmly, and even helped him find a nearby mechanic. It felt human, she said. Like he saw my son, not just a license plate. Back at the courthouse, she kept working quietly, steadily. She never took credit for the law. She didn't need to. The proof was in the shift. Fewer complaints, more trust. Officers who now paused before they acted. One afternoon, she walked past a training center and saw a group of recruits practicing a scenario. One played a woman sitting on a bench reading. The officer approached slowly, respectfully. "Hi, ma'am. Just checking in. Everything okay?" The woman nodded. "Just waiting for my ride." "Have a good day," the officer said and walked away. She smiled. Not because it was perfect, but because it was possible. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about her anymore. It was about building a world where dignity wasn't a privilege for the powerful, but a promise for everyone. And in that quiet transformation, she found something deeper than justice, healing. For herself, for the community, and for a system that finally chose to see. Years passed. Seasons changed. The oak tree in that quiet neighborhood grew taller, its branches wider, its leaves greener each spring. And one morning, a small group of people gathered beneath it, not in anger, not in protest, but in quiet reflection. They placed a simple bronze plaque at the base of the trunk. It didn't say, "Here, a woman was humiliated." It didn't name officers or recount the pain. It just read, "Here, dignity was tested. Here, justice began anew." No fanfare, no speeches. Just a few neighbors, a couple of students, and one woman in a modest coat who stood a little longer than the rest. She didn't touch the plaque. She just looked at it, then up at the branches that once held her bound, and nodded, like she was saying thank you, or goodbye, or both. Life had moved on, but the lesson hadn't faded. In fact, it had taken root. Across the state, police recruits now trained differently. They didn't just learn how to control a situation, they learned how to see the person in it. Role plays included scenarios where someone was sitting quietly, waiting, reading, just existing. Instructors asked, "What assumptions are you making? What if you're wrong?" New officers graduated not just with badges, but with a deeper understanding. That authority means nothing without humanity. Schools invited judges to speak, not about rulings or laws, but about fairness in everyday life. Kids learned that justice isn't just something that happens in courtrooms. It's in how you treat the new kid at lunch, how you listen when someone says they've been hurt, how you question your own first impressions. And she kept serving. Not louder, not flashier, but steadier. She never made the incident the centerpiece of her career. Instead, she let it fuel her work quietly, like a steady flame rather than a sudden spark. When new judges were sworn in, She'd meet with them privately not to give orders, but to share a truth she'd learned the hard way. The law must protect not just the powerful, but those mistaken for powerless. People often asked if she still thought about that day. She'd pause, then say something simple. I don't carry it as a wound. I carry it as a reminder, because the real victory wasn't in the firing of 2 officers or even the passing of a new law. It was in the thousands of small moments that followed. Moments no camera caught, no headline celebrated. Like the officer who paused before reaching for his cuffs and asked, Are you okay? Like the teenager who stood up in class and said, That's not how you treat someone, no matter who they are. Like the community meeting where a retired cop and a young activist finally listened to each other instead of talking past one another. She never sought fame from what happened. In fact, she avoided it, but her influence grew, not because she demanded it, but because she earned it through consistency, grace, and an unwavering belief that people can change, systems can improve, and pain can become purpose. One spring afternoon, she visited a high school civics class, just like she had years before. A student raised her hand and asked, Do you think things are really better now? She didn't give a polished answer. She looked out the window at the schoolyard where kids of all backgrounds laughed together and said, Better? Yes, fixed? No, but progress isn't about perfection. It's about people choosing every day to do a little better than yesterday. That night she walked home through her neighborhood. Streetlights flickered on. A neighbor waved from their porch. A dog barked playfully. Everything felt ordinary. And that was the point, because true justice isn't dramatic. It's not always on the news. It's in the quiet return to normalcy, where a person can sit on a bench, read a book, wait for a friend, and never once fear they'll be treated like a threat. The oak tree still stands. Kids climb its lower branches now. Couples take photos under its shade. Tourists sometimes stop to read the plaque, then stand in silence for a moment before walking on. And every year, on the anniversary of that hot August afternoon, someone leaves a single white rose at its base, not as a symbol of sorrow, but of hope that took root in hard ground. She never expected to become a symbol. She just wanted to do her job with integrity. But sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin not with a shout, but with a person standing still, bound, yes, but unbroken, and refusing to let the world define their worth. And in the end, that's what changed everything. Not the title she held, but the truth she lived, that dignity isn't given by others. It's claimed by how you carry yourself, even when the world tries to tie you down. Now, when young lawyers ask her for advice, she tells them this: Don't just study the law. Live it, protect it, and never forget, justice isn't just about who wins in court. It's about who feels safe walking home. The story didn't end with punishment or praise. It ended with possibility. And as long as people remember what happened under that tree, not to dwell in pain but to protect peace, it will keep growing. Like the branches, like the hope, like the quiet, unshakable belief that no one should ever have to prove they deserve to be treated like a human being.